The bustling harbor of Boston was unaware that a person of significance was disembarking. In truth, no one could have known that July of 1761 that a 7-year-old African girl brought across the ocean from the shores of that continent would one day become a transatlantic sensation. John Wheatley wanted to purchase a slave for his wife Susanna to help her as she aged. A little girl whom they judged to be about 7 years old was chosen, perhaps because of her age and demeanor, and it was suggestive of their favorite child Sarah, who had died when she was 7 years old. The little African was named Phillis after the ship on whence she came. Early accounts of Phillis observe that Mrs. Wheatley became quite attached to her and made her a friend, not a servant, and that she had a child's place in the house and in their hearts. As Phillis tended toward a frail constitution, she was not assigned any kind of serious labor. Recognizing keen intellectual ability in Phillis early on, the Wheatleys furnished her with a superb education superior to most white females her age. Within a year, Mary Wheatley had taught her how to read, and Phillis had figured out how to write on her own. Outstanding achievements for a child who knew no English upon her arrival. Phillis was incorporated socially, included in the company when guests called upon the Wheatleys, and accompanying them on social calls as well. Once, when the Wheatley's slave Prince was sent to bring Phillis home from visiting, he made the mistake of sharing the same seat with her on the return trip, and received a reprimand from Mrs. Wheatley. As she saw them drive into view, she was reported to have said, "Do but look at the saucy varlet, if he hasn't the impudence to sit upon the same seat with my Phillis." Phillis was composing verse in 1765 when she was about 12 years old, just a mere 4 years after her arrival in America. Poetry gave Phillis a voice which she would quickly learn to develop. 2 years later, in 1767, Phillis composed the poem In an Address to the Atheist, tackling a serious subject that many far beyond her years would shrink to confront, giving witness to her sense of poetic authority, which would continue as Phillis developed both her skill and her style. The Wheatleys felt it their duty to give Phillis a religious education. Phillis' acceptance of Christianity is reflected in what is perhaps her most well-known poem on being brought to America from Africa, claiming her slavery was God's mercy to her, bringing her salvation through her captivity. I quote, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." Phillis's embrace of Christianity led her to write an elegy on the death of the renowned Great Awakening evangelist George Whitefield, whom she most likely heard in person at least once or twice. The Countess of Huntingdon, to whom Whitefield was chaplain, was very impressed and agreed to undertake the patronage of her work, seeing not only this poem, but several others she had written to publication. In singing the praises of a well-known international figure, Phillis became known not only in the colonies, but to the greater transatlantic world, stirring great interest in her work and catapulting her to renown. It was decided that Phillis should go to London not only for her fragile health, but for the promotion of her soon-to-be-published volume of poetry. Interestingly, just a year prior, in June 1772, a landmark case against colonial slaveholders ruled that a slave brought to England from the colonies could not be legally forced to return to the colonies as a slave. While there is no evidence that Phillis considered remaining in London, it is also safe to assume that she and the Wheatleys would have been aware of this case and the possibilities it opened for Phillis personally. Realizing the fragile health of her mistress, and with the promise of emancipation upon her return, Phillis returned to Boston. Her own health had improved, and the publication of her book of verse was underway, of which the Countess insisted that a picture of Phillis be put on the cover, an especially rare thing in the 18th century to do during an author's lifetime. Shortly thereafter, her beloved Mrs. Wheatley passed away. In addition to this loss, Phillis, while free, was now responsible for her own keep. Having been sheltered and cared for by the Wheatleys, Phillis was ill-equipped for manual labor. Added to that was the stress of the oncoming American Revolution. When the port of Boston was closed by Parliament in spring of 1774, so too did many of Phillis's literary connections and support become close to her. Although she composed a poem for George Washington to commemorate his appointment as a commander of the Continental Army, there was no patronage to be found in the colonies. The last several years of Phillis Wheatley's life are somewhat of a mystery. After the death of John Wheatley in March of 1778, Phillis lost any support she had formerly known. Although she tried to publish another book of poetry, there was no kind patroness to support her endeavor. With her financial resources dwindling, Phillis married a man named Peters, but sources agree that the marriage was a failure. During these years, Phillis continued to write, though only 4 of her poems were published in the span of 1776 and her death in 1784. That Phillis died in poverty and ill health is sustained by all sources. No one can deny that Phillis Wheatley has been accorded a place of status in colonial history as the first published black female in America. The depth of her intellect, as well as her pleasant and deferring personality, brought her renown not only in her day, but years afterward. Phyllis Wheatley's life and accomplishments have been an undeniable witness to the abilities of the black American, attested to by the countless references to her and her work. As Phyllis's first biographer admonishes us, we think, gentle reader, she is as worthy a place in your thoughts as the heroines of the thousand tales that are dressed out to beguile your fancy. Remember that though the children of men regard feature and complexion, there is one who looketh upon the heart.